Yeah, I mean, one of the Dáil wits made the point over lunchtime that yesterday should have really been called Fiver Tuesday, with a fiver for everyone in the audience, unless, of course, you were a young person where you're deemed to be not good enough to even get the fiver, as if that's going to make a fundamental difference to the living standards of most people in this state. And I think, like everybody else, the Minister, I'm sure, would forgive us for being somewhat underwhelmed by the budget. And I mean, already I think all of us would have experienced a huge number of people being in touch with our offices, I suppose, making the point about the gigantic gulf that exists between the reality that is their lives and the spin and propaganda that has been developed around this budget. I could go on about them, but Martin from Sligo, who wrote to me about the so-called increase in the old age pension and the insulting fact that the social welfare payments have been delayed. I had a man, Stephen, from my own area, a construction worker who, as he says himself, forced to be in the bogus self-employment category. Nothing in the budget for him as well. Last time he was laid off, he was 6 months unemployed, cut off with no payments at all for 4 months of that, because it was deemed that he had earned an average of €188 a week in the year before that employment ceased. And of course Jane from Wexford, who nearly got sick listening to Minister Donoghue last night talking about the budget and talking about the fact that the largest health budget in the history of the state. And she made the point, if that's the case, why in God's name then does she have to beg, plead and very possibly protest for even the most basic of rights to do with her children, two of whom who have severe disabilities? And she pointed out that Minister Donoghue said that the increased budget meant that the HSE had increased responsibility and accountability at managerial level in the health service. But the reality that families are facing who interface with the HSE is that there's no accountability, there's no transparency whatsoever, and families are being put through hell to look for even basic resources. In this case, this mother, a lone parent because her husband tragically died, with two young children, both of whom have severe disabilities, is facing the prospect of having to protest for a couple of extra hours' help so she can bring one of those young men to the hospital. And the response she's got from the HSE is more or less, keep it up and we'll force you to put this young fella into foster care. An insult to her when he has a family and a loving family to look after him, not to mind the cost to the state should he be put in foster care, which his family don't want. And that level of incompetence and mismanagement in the HSE is shackled throughout the organisation. Now, yesterday, we, along with I think a lot of deputies in the House, got an invitation to attend the premiere of Ken Loach's award-winning film I, Daniel Blake, which sadly was clashing with the budget. So we were faced with a choice. Do we sit around and listen to the usual nonsense and platitudes coming around the budget time, or would we go and see this film about an unemployed man, a man who'd worked all his life as a carpenter, becomes ill through a heart attack and is put through the rigours in trying to access social welfare benefits, and the people he meets along that journey, and the new face of our new buzzword system of social protection and social assistance. So we made the only choice, I think, the absolute correct choice, and I don't mean to be in any way flippant about it. We thought we'd learn a hell of a lot more by going and seeing that film last night, and I would strongly recommend that the Minister and every deputy in this House goes and sees that film when it premieres and begins in the Lighthouse next Friday, the 21st of October. And I'm not in any way saying this as a joke. I'm saying it very really, because the reality is, for all the spin and all the jargon, the systems of social welfare, or social protection as it's incorrectly called in this state, are copied at every turn from what goes on in Britain. And the system that was exposed in that film of dehumanising people, of forcing people, making them think that they're spongers and scroungers, people who've worked all their lives, putting them into fake training schemes, telling them how to do CVs for jobs that are never there, people who would love to work, if they had the ability to work health-wise, or if the jobs were there for that. And it really brought home to me the discussion that we had during Minister's questions with Minister Varadkar last week, when other deputies highlighted some of the copied systems that we have from the United Kingdom. We have the versions of CTEC and all the others. And the Minister was able to get away with painting a picture of people on our system who are being offered positions of employment, inverted commas, which would cost them hundreds of euros to take up that opportunity, with no realistic prospect of a decent job at the end of it. And the Minister was able to caricature those people and more or less portray them as people sitting at home waiting for a dream job, not people who've been pauperised by this system and lack of opportunity, lack of childcare and so on. And I don't need to make the points about childcare because it's well been articulated. Fair enough, if you can access childcare, you can get some benefit from the new system, but if you haven't got the means to do that, and your mother or your mother-in-law are minding your kids, or you're a stay-at-home mother, you're not benefiting at all from those provisions. And I think it's completely wrong that we are putting a huge emphasis on these false, in many ways, training schemes, the gateway projects, people who worked all their lives and paid their contribution to society, being forced to sign up to a scheme with a local authority to go around picking up litter, while jobs in the operative section in local authorities are being diminished and young fellas leaving school can't ever aspire to a manual job in a council or a government building where you might be able to, even if you didn't get your leaving, move up through the ranks, that you might actually have the audacity to think that you could have a roof over your head and that your kids would be educated. But we have the irony of a society now with more wealth than it's ever had, but it's in a smaller amount of hands, and we've greater levels of inequality than we ever had before. And to me, that's just utterly reprehensible. And I honestly think that we are demeaning people, we are degrading them in the manner in which we treat them and the manner in which they interface with our social services, and it's not right. I was going to read the quote from the film at the end of the film, which summed up what we're not doing. I don't know if we'll be able to hold it together without crying, so maybe I won't, but the bottom line about it is what this man sort of proudly claims at the end is that he's not a client or a customer or a service user or a shirker or a scrounger or a beggar or an insurance number. He's somebody who's paid his dues and was proud to do so. He never asked for charity or looked for it. He said, you know, I'm a man, not a dog. I demand my rights. I demand respect. I'm a citizen. Nothing more, nothing less. And we've lost the concept of citizenship and what that means, and we're not creating a society. We're creating a gulf between a myth and spin on the one hand and the real lives of people at the other. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into all the points, but there's no doubt about it, and other deputies have referred to it, but many of the measures in the budget are designed to make those who already have a greater share of the wealth even wealthier. I mean, the Special Assignee Relief Programme is basically going to cost the guts of £5 million that I think could have been better used on public services. The points have been made about the inheritance tax, again benefiting about 2,000 people at a cost of £20 million to the state. And you're bragging on about the £35 million on childcare, but, you know, £20 million has been written off to the benefit of approximately 2,000 people, which to me, I think, puts it very much in perspective. And while you might sort of say, oh, well, sure, isn't it great now we have 1,000 extra nursing posts provided in the budget, and that's very good, but, you know, it doesn't undo the damage of the fact that we're down 5,200 nursing posts since the recession, that we have a deficit of 17% in the number of midwifery staff needed to run our maternity services, and the absolute crisis that exists in our maternity services as a result. 8 maternity hospitals currently under investigation for the tragic deaths of either babies or women in a country which a few years ago used to be lauded as being the safest country in the world to give birth. Well, sadly, not anymore, and those cutbacks are not being undone. Deputy Wallace has dealt much better than me about the money, the so-called misnamed Help to Buy scheme. Give a few bob to the developer scheme. Really, it's an absolute joke and is going to do no good, and actually will probably do a lot of harm rather. But the last points I wanted to make really were in relation to pensions, because there's been a huge amount of play about pensions in the media. And, you know, in some ways, I suppose it shows Fianna Fáil's historic policy of kind of vote buying from its clientele, the over 65s, in terms of the mileage they've been making out of this issue. And while I obviously welcome the fact that the pensioners are getting €5, I have to say it's not enough. And not only is it not enough, it doesn't do anything to address the shameful inequalities that exist in our pension system. And to me, that is just completely unacceptable. I mean, we have for thousands now of Irish women, and indeed some men, some of whom have worked 30, 40 years, a full contributory pension is being denied to them because they didn't do paid work for periods of their working life for a variety of reasons. It might have been caring for children, it might have been because they volunteered abroad, it might have been because they were suffering from depression. Whatever the reason is, in many cases, women in particular were forced out of the workforce by the marriage bar, and now in their later years are being punished again by the failure of this government again to redress that inequality, and being punished, if you like, with reduced pensions. Because what many of these women did when their children were reared and they came back and re-entered the workforce, if you like, because their contributions were being based on an entire working life, it meant they won't get the full benefit of that. Meanwhile, somebody who hadn't worked all their lives until, say, for example, they were 54 years of age, if they only started working then and they made PRSI contributions for 10 years, those people would get a full pension. But other people who worked in some instances 30 years wouldn't, because of and I just think that's ludicrously unfair, and I really don't see why the government didn't correct that unfairness. It's completely wrong. I know that the Minister for Social Protection plans to bring in a new total contribution system to correct the unfairness, but the plan is to bring that in by 2020, and sadly some of the women and men who will benefit from this may not be here then, and particularly the case because he said he's not going to backdate it. So any of the people in that situation are not going to benefit from that regard. And I just think it's completely wrong. I mean, I'll just briefly read into the record a letter from a constituent of mine who wrote to Minister Varadkar in relation to this issue and how disappointed she is that this isn't being addressed. And she said to the Minister, "Your response gives no understanding of the circumstances which could have led to women having atypical PRSI contributions histories. These were often due to societal expectations on women, such as rearing and caring for children, both healthy or suffering from intellectual or physical impairments. As a parent of an intellectually impaired daughter, I could teach you a few facts on that score. Not alone was there a dearth of childcare facilities, but there were even less facilities with those with such impairments. Include into this mix the women who were required to care for elderly or ailing parents, and a clear picture of the impossible position which women were placed in back in the 1960s and early 70s begins to appear. Now those same women who were relied so heavily on by the state to give their time post-marriage to caring duties are being penalised heavily and shamelessly by the same state. It defies all reason and demonstrates neither empathy nor understanding of the circumstances which led to the atypical contribution history of these women." And I could not put that better myself. And when we talk about looking after older people and we look after equality and a new Ireland, well, let's start dealing with that for real and deal with the women who brought this country to where it is, reared and looked after people and are not in any way getting the benefit of that. Cathaoirleach, look, I have lots more points to make. I wanted to make about the shameful waste of money in further giving taxpayers' money to Horse Racing Ireland, who will be in front of the Agricultural Committee tomorrow, to the greyhound industry, a diminishing industry which has shamed us internationally for its appalling treatment of greyhounds and so on. There are so many examples where we could have spent the money better. So I would say, Minister, in conclusion, I honestly think that this budget is a missed opportunity. It's, stunningly unambitious, actually, and incredibly dull in its content, and it will not do anything to address the fundamental inequalities which actually your government have served to increase rather than reduce.